The global elites plan to take control of your money. And I believe they're going to do this through a central bank digital currency. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the origin story of the Federal Reserve and how, if we understand how the Fed was created, and not just the Fed, but the first central bank in the United States, we can see how this may point directly to the central bank digital currency, or Fed coin, that Jerome Powell and a lot of other central bankers have been talking about. To explore this further, let's go right to the internet. Let's start by going to the Minneapolis Fed website. I'd like to point out the Fed was not the first central bank in the United States. The first central bank was called Bank of the United States. It was set up in 1791 by Alexander Hamilton. And if we dig in a little deeper and understand why this bank was set up and what Alexander Hamilton's intentions actually were, this sheds light on what the motives may be with today's Fed coin, or central bank digital currency. Check this out. Though the intent of the bank was to facilitate government finances, Hamilton had another goal in mind: to function as a commercial bank. At the time of the Revolution, there were barely any banks in the colonies. Britain had used its authority to protect its own banks and prevent the development of financial rivals. Hamilton's vision was to create a central source of capital that could be lent to new businesses and thereby develop the nation's economy. So while in some ways the first bank prefigured the Federal Reserve, it also differed from it significantly by offering commercial loans. In other words, this central bank was offering loans directly into the real economy. It didn't have to go through the commercial banking system like the current day Federal Reserve. So hopefully right now you're connecting the dots and you see that a central bank digital currency would give today's Federal Reserve the power that Alexander Hamilton envisioned all the way back in 1791. So that was the first central bank we had in the United States. But the Fed, the current day Fed, isn't the second one. It's actually the third one. The second one was created in 1816 and went to 1836. And it was smashed by Andrew Jackson, who absolutely hated the idea of central banks. And I think it's fascinating, his rationale. Listen to this. Jackson hadn't forgotten the lessons from earlier years of the central bank's existence, that such a powerful private institution was susceptible to corruption and would be difficult to control. It's amazing that he saw this almost 200 years ago, but yet today, 99.9% of Americans can't see what's right in front of their eyes and what history has taught us about the central banks over and over and over again, with not only corruption, but also Andrew Jackson's next point. For that, let's go to Wikipedia, where they point out Jackson regarded the central bank as a corrupt institution that benefited the wealthy at the expense of ordinary Americans. Again, it's something we see playing out in real life today in modern times that Andrew Jackson foresaw almost 200 years ago. So Hamilton wanted a central bank that could lend directly into the real economy. For the next set of clues that can shed light on what the motivation may be now for central bankers adopting a central bank digital currency, let's go to the Great Depression. I've got a chart starting at 1914 all the way to 1941. And these charts were given to me by Jeff Snider, my good buddy. So Jeff, thank you very much. Hat tip. Hat tip to Jeff. On the left, we go from 0 all the way up to $60 billion. The first chart represents M2 money supply, or the equivalent back during this time frame. So during World War I, of course, the money supply increases dramatically because they are printing money to pay for the war. Then we know what happened in the Depression of the early 1920s that no one, other than Jim Grant, really talks about. The money supply did contract, but then it went up consistently throughout the Roaring '20s. And then it went down by almost a third during the beginning of the Great Depression. The Fed reversed course, then the money supply continued to grow, and then it went parabolic during World War II. Now let's go ahead and contrast M2 money supply, or the bank deposits, interbank time and demand in the real economy, to the Fed's balance sheet. Same time frame, 1914 to 1941. On the left, it goes from 0 up to $25 billion. As you can imagine, the Fed's balance sheet goes up during World War I, goes down and stays pretty consistent, although it goes up toward the latter stages of the 1920s. It goes down at the beginning of the Depression, which led people like Milton Friedman to blame the Great Depression, the majority of it, on the Fed contracting base money or bank reserves at the specific point in time when they should have increased the supply of bank reserves. And I made a note to pull up Jeff's chart specifically because it goes into greater nuance. We can see that they increased the amount of bank notes circulating in the system, which would make sense because there were these bank runs, but then they decreased the amount of reserves, which caused many of the banks, in addition to a lot of other problems they were dealing with, to go bust. And what they didn't realize is how dependent the economy had become on the banking system. Many of the mainstream economists today that really shaped the thinking for monetary policy implemented by global central bankers, people like Ben Bernanke, point to one idea in particular that led to the mistakes, or what they perceived to be mistakes, that the Fed made back at the beginning of the 1930s. It's something called real bills doctrine, or the real bills doctrine. It's very esoteric, but it's crucial we understand what this is to then lay out the probabilities for the Fed today or other central bankers adopting a central bank digital currency, which will give them control over your money. So to take a deep dive on the real bills doctrine, let's go right back to the internet. The real bills doctrine says that as long as bankers lend to businessmen only against the security or collateral of short-term 30, 60, or 90-day commercial paper representing claims to real goods in the process of production, the loans will be just sufficient to finance the production of goods. So what they're saying is that if a company needed short-term money, maybe for 30 or 60 days, to purchase widgets that they would use to produce a product and then sell, and once they sold that product into the real economy, then they could pay back the loan. Since the short-term increase in money supply would be used to facilitate productivity, you would never have to worry about consumer price inflation. So think about how far the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction, to the point today, especially going back to 2005 and 2006, you can get $1 million home loan if you can just barely spell your name and fog a mirror. It's unbelievable how far we have come in what I would argue is the wrong direction. Let's go back to the days, maybe not taking it to this extreme, but go back to the days where banks actually prioritized, and thought leaders, economists, prioritized sound money and price stability, meaning prices aren't going up or aren't going down. That the amount of lending or currency units, bank liabilities, dollars in existence should have one purpose, and that's to maximize productivity and the production of goods and services. The Wikipedia article also points out that Doctrine has roots with individuals like Adam Smith and John Law. Law's economic objectives were exactly what we were just referring to. He sought to limit monetary expansion and maintain price stability. But many of the historians and economists today point to this real bills doctrine or idea as one of the main contributors to the Great Depression. And here's another example where we can see just how radically different the central bankers are today than they were back during the Great Depression. Fed board member Adolph C. Miller in 1929 launched his direct pressure initiative. It required all member banks seeking Federal Reserve discount window assistance to affirm that they had never made a speculative loan, especially of the stock market variety. Can you believe that? Back then, the banks had to prove that they didn't lend for any speculative activity. Now, the central banks encourage them to lend for speculative activity. That's the whole point of quantitative easing. When you read history, it just blows your mind how drastically things have changed. But the bottom line is, because of this strong belief system in the real bills doctrine, many of the central bankers at the time just decided that it's better to let banks go bust than to actually lend for something that isn't involving the production of goods and services. Now, I think commercial banks should only lend for productive purposes. Sounds like a great idea to me, and I think our society would be far better today if they had such a strict adherence to those ideas. But should the central bank be limited to that type of lending? Or should we even have a central bank? I'm not sure. I'll let you be the judge, and that's a topic for a completely separate whiteboard video. But today we want to focus on what the motivations are for the current day central bankers to create a central bank digital currency that will give them control over your money. So the main takeaways from step number 1 is Alexander Hamilton set up the first central bank in the United States with the objective of lending directly into the real economy, something a central bank digital currency would give the current day Fed the power to do at will. Next is today's historians and a lot of economists believe that the Fed really lost control of the monetary system during the 1920s. The commercial banking system really took over, and they didn't understand the extent to which the economy was tied to the commercial banking system. Therefore, when we had the start of the Great Depression, the Fed made some policy errors due to this real bills doctrine belief system, which was applicable maybe prior to the 1920s, but in their minds, it wasn't applicable to the modern day economy. They believe this exacerbated the Great Depression and the deflation we saw during the 1930s. And it was all a result of the central bank losing control over the money system. In other words, they lost control over the dollar. Step number 2, the Fed completely loses control of the entire monetary system. In step number 1, we briefly went over how the Fed in the 1920s lost control of the domestic supply of dollars. And they didn't even realize how much the commercial banking system had taken over that role, which may have led to some bad policy choices in the early 1930s. I know the monetarists and the Austrians would have different views there. And this video isn't about telling you who's right or wrong. It's just about giving you the history of what actually happened so you can determine the probabilities of the current central bankers adopting a central bank digital currency. We're going to connect all these dots and put the pieces of the puzzle together in step number 3. But for step number 2, I want to illustrate how, starting with Bretton Woods in 1944, the dollar becoming the world reserve currency, the Fed and the domestic policymakers, the central planners, not only lost control of the domestic supply of dollars, but now they lose control over the international supply of dollars as well. So this is what happened. You guys all know how Triffin's paradox or Triffin's dilemma works. Basically, what it's saying is that in order for the global economy to grow at full capacity, it's going to need dollars if the dollar is the world reserve currency, and that's how business is done globally. As Jeff Snider would say, there needs to be elasticity with the dollar supply, not only domestically, but internationally as well. And if you think through how dollars actually get outside of the United States, it's really by the US running a trade deficit, because we're importing goods, but yet we're exporting those dollars that the global economy can then use to facilitate maximum growth. But if there's not enough dollars getting outside of the United States, if we're not running large enough trade deficits, or in other words, if we're not hollowing out our manufacturing base enough, then it's going to be detrimental to global growth. So what happened in the 1960s is the economists really started to understand that there was this banking system that was sprung up in the shadows, the Eurodollar system, that was supplying the globe with the dollars they need. Therefore, the United States, the Fed, and the central planners really didn't have to worry about it. They said, great, the free market is doing its job. It's supplying the amount of currency units or dollars it needs to function. This led them to a monetary policy that is summarized by the term benign neglect. So they just pretend that it really doesn't exist, and then they just try to micromanage the domestic banks, and they think that has a trickle down or trickle up effect to the Eurodollar system itself. But in the back of their minds, they realize they've completely lost control over the dollar, especially when you compare it to the way it worked prior to World War I. And now the dollar-based monetary system was completely dependent on not only the domestic commercial banking system, but also the international commercial banking system. When you see things through that lens, it becomes crystal clear why whenever there's a problem with the banking system, the government or the Fed come in and immediately bail them out. They're not necessarily bailing out the banks. They're really bailing out the global dollar monetary system itself. Step number 3. Now let's go ahead and connect the dots so you can determine the probabilities of the Fed adopting a central bank digital currency so they can have more control or total control over your money. Let's review what we have learned from history. The first central bank of the United States was set up by Alexander Hamilton, not only to facilitate the government's bidding, but also to lend money directly into the real economy. This was the idea behind the original Federal Reserve. And I want to point out as a quick side note, Andrew Jackson absolutely nails it as to why we, the general public, should be extremely leery of a central bank. It leads to massive corruption and benefits the wealthy at the expense of the poor and middle class. Historians and today's economists believe that the Fed started to lose control over the domestic monetary system and supply of dollars during the 1920s. And as a result of not understanding how the system worked, they created the Great Depression by not taking action. They were too complacent. They should have done more to fix the problem. And then, after Bretton Woods, because of Triffin's dilemma and the Eurodollar system, they not only lose control over the dollar domestically, they lose control over it internationally as well. So now they are at the complete mercy of the commercial banking system. And this is what leads to bailouts. But you've got to assume that in their minds, they believe if they could take back that control and that power over the dollar monetary system, they could better adjust, we'll call it, the rates of inflation. They could also target lending to specific groups. As an example, now they've got a mandate for, let's call it inflation, full employment, price stability. Ironically enough, what they call prices always going up. But these are basically their mandates. But they could also take on another mandate of, let's say, climate change, equality, social justice, you name it. And therefore, if they had power over that dollar system, then they could better direct lending and where the resources were going based on the societal narrative and the political narrative. In other words, what's going to buy the politicians the most amount of votes. When you look at it through that framework, it becomes crystal clear why the global elite, such as the World Economic Forum, the IMF, and the central bankers themselves, are moving towards this digital currency. But here's how logistically it would work. Right now, we've got the Fed, the banking system, the commercial banks, and the real economy. I use this red dollar sign, as most of you are familiar with from watching my videos, to indicate the Fed really only has control of creating or destroying bank reserves based on assets they're buying or selling to the commercial banks themselves. But in order to increase the amount of dollars to stoke inflation, as an example, they're really dependent upon the commercial banks themselves taking action. Of course, this excludes the government, your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, spending money into the real economy and the Fed monetizing it. We'll save that for a separate video. But prior to the shenanigans of 2020, where M2 money supply has gone up by 25% because of government spending and debt monetization by the Fed, the commercial banking system really had control domestically and definitely internationally over the amount of dollars being created or destroyed that's getting into the real economy. But remember, that wasn't the original idea Hamilton had when he set up the first central bank. And obviously, the 900 PhDs at the Fed, including Jerome Powell and Janet Yellen at the Treasury, know this very well. So if they instituted a central bank digital currency, it would give them the ability to go around the commercial banking system, potentially even wipe them out altogether. Because everyone, the entities and the individuals in the real economy, would have an account with the Fed. Therefore, they could take these bank reserves and turn them into dollars, legal tender, as Dr. Lacey Hunt would put it. Basically, what would happen is the balance sheets for all of the banks would be consolidated into one balance sheet at the Federal Reserve. And what's interesting, or maybe terrifying is a better word, is they could control the dollar creation in the real economy. They could also micromanage inflation through positive and negative interest rates. but they could also have all these additional mandates, or they could direct the flow of lending to special projects that had been adopted by the central planners themselves, such as the Great Reset agenda. And they could do this without the federal government taking on any more debt. If you think about this, all of these transactions would be between the Fed and the real economy, just like the transactions are between the banking system and the real economy right now. So if there's a loan that's created by the bank that creates additional dollars in the real economy, that isn't affecting the balance sheet of the government. But now we're in a position where the government has to take on more and more debt to spend the money into existence, and the Fed has to buy the debt through the shell game with the primary dealer banks after they buy it at auction. So I don't want to get things too complex here, but the bottom line is right now, the way the system is set up, in order for the Fed or the central planners to directly influence the amount of dollars in the real economy going around the commercial banking system, the government has to spend the money into existence, therefore issue the debt the Fed has to buy. So that affects the balance sheet of the federal government. But in this scenario, the Fed would go directly into the real economy. They could achieve all of those objectives, no matter how nefarious or benign they may be, but they could achieve those objectives without getting the government or their balance sheet involved in the equation. And this is why I think the probabilities are very high that we see a Fed coin and multiple central bank digital currencies in the future. So what prevents the central planners from executing this central bank digital currency game plan that will give them all of the power and the control over the global monetary system, and more importantly, your money? The answer is the law, the Constitution, and the Federal Reserve Act, that in my opinion, they have completely ignored for a long, long time, but especially going back to March of 2020. And that's why my good friend Robert Barnes and I are taking action against the Fed to try to prevent all central planners from ignoring the law in the future. Because at the end of the day, the law is the only thing that protects us from outright tyranny. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.